Hello there. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the very first session in a three-part series on the warrior ethos of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, of World War II. I'm Captain Carrie Wise, an instructor pilot for the 94th Flying Training Squadron, based at Davis Airfield on the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I will be your host today as we begin our discussion with expert historian, Dr. Catherine Sharp-Landeck. Behind the scenes is my teammate, Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Thomas, also an instructor pilot for the 94th. She will be monitoring the chat and ensuring all of our tech runs smoothly today. Before we get going too far, I would like to go over just a few housekeeping notes. First off, please keep mics muted and cameras turned off for the duration of this session. The session is being recorded and the recording will capture any user with sound on, so please keep those mics muted. The chat will be used to deliver links and any additional information, but we have turned off the option for attendees to post to the public forum. However, you can still use that chat function to post any questions that may come up along the way. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas will select a few of those questions for the end of the session and pose them to Dr. Landeck. Today's event is sponsored by the United States Air Force Academy Center for Character and Leadership Development in association with the National Character and Leadership Symposium, or NCLS, 2021. This year's NCLS will be held on the 25th and 26th of February. We will post the registration information for NCLS later on in the chat. All of this is in support of USAFA's mission to develop leaders of character. Each year, NCLS chooses a theme associated with a core tenet of that mission. This year, the theme is Warrior Ethos. Warrior Ethos is the embodiment of the warrior spirit. It's tough-mindedness, tireless motivation, an unceasing vigilance, a willingness to sacrifice one's life for the country if necessary, and a commitment to be the world's premier air, space, and cyberspace force. The women who flew in World War II truly embody the ideal warrior ethos, and we will spend the next 3 weeks discussing just how the WASP were created, what they did during the war, and their lives and endeavors afterward. It is so critical for us to have these discussions and to hear their stories, as unfortunately, there are not many WASPs left. In fact, we just lost another WASP last week, B. Haydu. She was WASP class of 44W7. To honor her memory, I invite you now to join me for 44 seconds of silence. Thank you so much for that moment of silence. B. Haydu made such a lasting impact and will absolutely be missed. Joining us for this three-part series is Dr. Catherine Sharp-Landeck. Dr. Landeck is an associate professor of history at Texas Women's University, the home of the WASP Archives. She's a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a Normandy Scholar, and a graduate of the University of Tennessee, where she earned her PhD. Dr. Landeck has received numerous awards for her more than 2 decades of work on the WASP and has appeared as an expert on NPR's Morning Edition, PBS, and the History Channel. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Time. In addition, Dr. Landeck published her first book in 2020 titled The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. Dr. Landeck, welcome to our very first session. Would you please start us out by going over some broad information about the WASP? What are the key facts and figures you would like the participants to know about the women Air Force service pilots?
To thank you too for that moment of silence on for B. Haydu. B was a good friend of mine, and it's one of those blows. She reached 100. And that was her goal, and it makes you feel good to know she made that, but it's still selfishly you're sad to see her go. Some of the, just the basic, make sure everybody's up to speed about who the Wasp were. These are, there were 1,102 of these women who earned their silver wings, either in training or directly by going into the fairing division. But you have a number of these women who, you have something like 25,000 women who apply to be a part of this program. So they're coming out of that golden age of aviation. They're young, they're in their 20s, most of them, and they've grown up learning about Charles Lindbergh and learning about Amelia Earhart and all of that. So that sense of where you all are, aviation is everything and everybody talks about it and lives it. But, in the rest of the world, not everybody quite understands it. When these WASP grew up, everybody was passionate about it and loved it. So, you have 25,000 women who apply to this program. Only 1,830 are admitted to training because there were so many who wanted to do this. It was a very elite group. A lot of them had college education, something like 80% of them at a time that only 4% of American women had a college education. They met all the same standards as the male cadets did. They had the same fitness standards. They had higher education standards. They had to have some flight time before they were admitted to training, which is something that the male cadets coming in and being drafted into the military didn't. And I think that's one thing that I always like to say, and especially to this audience, is that, every woman who served in the military from the beginning of time to the present is a volunteer. Not bashing the men who were drafted and things like that, of course, but every single woman you meet in the military was a volunteer. And these women who served as WASP in World War II, the same. So again, kind of big picture, you have a number of different jobs that these women ended up doing during the war. First, they were brought in as ferry pilots, because if you think about all those realities of, you think of the war and you think of we're building airplanes and we've got Rosie the Riveter out there doing her best to build the planes and all of this. Well, all those planes that are being built in Dallas and Chicago and Detroit and out in California, they've got to get to the different coasts to get sent overseas, and somebody has to fly those. We're behind in the fall of 1942. We're not doing well in the war. And they realize, the Army Air Forces realizes they need as many pilots as they can to do this job, but they need to get the men overseas. And so they decide to have this experiment to see if women can serve as pilots flying these things. So that's the first job that the women do, is they ferry these planes from the factories to the points of embarkation. But very quickly, the Army Air Forces realizes, hey, maybe we can use women in other jobs and do other, domestic flying work. So they start flying towing targets behind planes, because you've got to train the men on the ground to shoot at a moving airplane. So you have, people flying the planes with targets and behind them. If you've ever been to a beach or the football game and you see, a little 152 or something flying around with a banner, advertising Domino's pizza or whatever, that's the same kind of thing. The target was a little longer than that. But now imagine the men firing at that target with live ammunition. And that was one of the first jobs that the women did. They flew non-flying personnel where they needed to go. There's one WASP who flew the Army chaplain from base to base every Sunday, and she didn't go to church for the 10 years after the war because she'd gotten all her churching in the 2 years she flew for the Army. So they just did whatever needed to be done. Jacqueline Cochran called it aerial dishwashing. All those domestic flying jobs that had to be done. They weren't glamorous. They weren't necessarily fun, but somebody needed to do them. So that's what the Wasp did. Whether it was weather flying or experimenting with remote controlled aircraft, or even learning to fly the B-29 in just a few days so that they could go on a tour and prove to the men who didn't want to fly it that the plane was safe. So just any of those domestic flying jobs that you can imagine needing to be done in World War II, that's what the women did. And they did it very well. Their accident numbers were lower than the men. Their fatality rate was equal or lower to the men that were doing the same types of jobs. And they were just really, by the end, very well respected by all of the men that they served with. So that's kind of the big picture background. And let me know if you want more, but I know you've got some specific things you wanted to talk about today. So I can always fill in as you'd like.
That was awesome. It's really interesting to hear aerial dishwashing.
Yeah.
To kind of put it in perspective of like, what are women doing in society at the time,
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
perspective or context.
Right. And they called it that on purpose because that's not threatening, right? Women flying military planes was kind of entering that male sphere and kind of a macho world. And if it's just dishwashing, aerial dishwashing, that's very non-threatening, right? Oh, just let the women do it. It's just the mundane stuff, get that, pot roast off the pan kind of flying.
It's an interesting way to introduce women into military aviation as, oh, it's not threatening. We're not going to do anything like too dangerous. So you mentioned between ferrying or carrying targets and training. So I understand there's two separate organizations before the Wasp is actually created. Can you talk to us kind of about those two different commands and the women that led them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am going to make a little correction. So it's often presented that way, as there's two totally different things, and then they combine into the Wasp. And the reality is they were always one thing. There were just these two parts of it. Nancy Love was a prominent woman pilot in the 1930s, kind of not famous, but well respected and well known. She did a lot of test flying for different aircraft manufacturers. She did a lot of the aerial marking of barns and that kind of thing to, because you don't have GPSs, right? You need aerial navigation. And the best way to do that is to mark the barns so pilots can find their way to the airport. She just did all sorts of really good flying in the 1930s. And she worked with the Air Transport Command to bring in women as ferry pilots. And that was her big push. And she brings them in and they become known as the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. And then at the same time, Jacqueline Cochran comes in, and that group of ferry pilots were really highly experienced women. They had over 200 hours of flight time. They had a 200 horsepower rating. And this is at a time when flying is expensive and 200 horsepower planes are not popular, right? I mean, the Piper Cub has a 60 horsepower motor. So this is going to be kind of an elite group of women. Some of them were incredibly wealthy. Some of them were just really effective pilots who worked really hard to gain their flight time. Teresa James is one of those examples. But you've got that ferry command, and that was the job that the Army Air Forces saw women doing, was ferry pilots. But the idea was they wanted more women to be qualified to do that. And there were only, fewer than 50 women in the country that were qualified to do that. So they start this parallel program that is going to train women with some flight time, bring them up, level them, if you will, and then feed them into the ferry command, into the WAFs. So where it's often seen as these two separate things, in reality, General Arnold, right? You guys, Henry Hap Arnold was adamant that he was not going to have two separate women's programs. This was one program. It was just two stages of this one program. So you've got the ferry command, and then this other part of the program is the training division, right? The women's flight training division. And that was led by Jacqueline Cochran. Of course, Jacqueline Cochran was very famous in the 1930s for her flying. She won national and international air races. She was good friends with Amelia Earhart, although she was determined to, as Jackie said, put her in the shade of her own star, and was just an incredible pilot. Won all sorts of awards, knew, General Robert Olds and Hap Arnold, and, sat at lunch with them and worked on committees with them and was very prominent. And the idea that Jackie had was that more women could do this, right? More women could serve as these pilots. And so she wanted to take those women with less flight time, less experience, give them more training, going through the Army Air Force's training, identical to what male cadets were going through, and to bring them in. And so what happened is you have those first classes of women. First, they train in Houston, Texas. Then, if any of you know Houston, the weather's not very conducive to flying. They were flying out of the commercial airfield, and, you'd have their little, low horsepower single-seater plane taking off behind a Boeing, DC-7 and, commercial passenger liner. And so they moved to Sweetwater, Texas, which is where they trained. And Jackie's idea was these women are going to get up to speed, and then they get fed into the WAFs. So you have women from those earlier classes who become WAFs, right? They become those ferry pilots. And it's not until the summer of 1943 that they decide to expand the jobs, right? They've kind of got enough ferry pilots. Let's see what else women can do. And that's when they come up with the name of the Women Air Force Service Pilots. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the name, and maybe it's just because I'm a geek about these women in this program, is there were male service pilots, right? Men who were service pilots for the Army Air Forces. They had an S in the middle of their wing as service pilots. So these women were women service pilots, right? They're supposed to do the same type of kind of odd job work as the men did. And then General Arnold was all about acronyms, right? He wanted neat acronyms. He wanted to be able to call things, neat names. And so that's, I think, where the Air Force comes in. It's all one word, but then you can call them WASP. So it's Women Air Force Service Pilots. And it's this, they're very similar to the male service pilots in the work that they were doing. So where it seems on the surface, and a lot of people say this and think about this as, okay, you've got these two groups that merge into one. In reality, they were always two groups of one, they were one program, just two parts of one program. And then they get a new, more unifying name in 1943.
We definitely like our acronyms.
I know.
So you mentioned Jackie Cochran a couple of times. I've heard Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran have very different visions for what the women can do, and very different approaches to what the WASP should look like.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Cochran is ultimately the one who leads the WASP. How do you think she got into that position, and how did the two women, what were they hoping to get out of having women in military aviation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And you're quite right. They had completely different visions. And that's a real distinction about these women and the program. Nancy Love, from the beginning, from the late 1930s, she talked about this program. Nancy Love wanted, this very small group of women. And again, she went into the CAA records, right? This is the precursor to the FAA, and found the women who would be qualified to do this job. And there were fewer than 50, right? Right around 50. And the idea is to bring these 50 women in, to integrate them into the greater ferry command, and just have them help, and be a part of it. Jackie had this much broader vision of bringing in thousands, literally thousands of women pilots. and having them do all these different jobs. So these are not compatible ideas, right? They are very different. And really by that summer of 1943 is when that decision is made that the Army Air Forces are going to go with Jackie's plan, right? That they see the work that these women can do, that they see these programs. So Nancy ends up continuing to lead those ferry pilots. And Jackie leads the greater program. So she decides who graduating from training goes into the ferry command and who doesn't, and who leaves the ferry command and goes to different places. And part of this is Jackie's personality. Jackie always wants to be in charge. That's just part of who Jackie was. But she really, she believed that the women should be a separate part of the Army Air Forces, right? She did not want them to be integrated into the greater group. Some argue it's because she wanted to keep control over the women. I think that it really fits her personality of thinking women had these, women were special and should be treated that way and protected. Where if you integrate women across the greater air forces, that they can get lost, they can get hurt. She was worried about sexual assault. She doesn't talk about it in those words, but it was a concern of hers. She had experienced it herself when she was a child and working in the factories. So, she was, I won't say she was a prude, but she was very worried about the women's image and the women's, she was worried about their safety, but definitely wanted, she didn't want any scandals, right? She didn't want anything like that. And the best way she could control that was to control the women. And the Army Air Forces, I mean, she knew General Arnold well, from her flying, pre-war flying and others. And, sometimes it was easier to just let Jackie run things than to argue with Jackie.
That's a fun way to explain it there. Letting Jackie have her way.
Right. And so, she was working hard and getting a lot done and getting women into these different positions. And I think one thing that's really important is the fact that they saw this as an experiment, right? It's all through the documents. And some of the Wasp, Behadu, actually, who we just lost this weekend, Behadu and I had many conversations, and she hated it when I called them an experiment. We'd give talks together and I'd give an introduction and talk about them being an experiment. And it'd be her turn next. She'd say, I don't like it when she calls us an experiment. We were great. No, it's like, yeah, but all the Army documents talk about the experiment of women pilots, right? It was an experiment. Nobody thought women could really do this. They were like, well, maybe they can, maybe they can't. Let's see what they can do. Oh, they do that well. Can they do this well? Let's just try all these different things. And Jackie was all about making sure that women got the chance to try all these different types of flying, where Nancy wanted that very small group to do things. And she pushed the envelope all the time too, right? Nancy was a pilot's pilot, and she wanted to get into those different planes where her women, even the ferry women with 200 horsepower ratings, they were limited to those Cubs and those, lighter aircraft. And she pushed them, and she climbed into the cockpit of an AT-6, and she climbed into the cockpit of the P-51. And she said, look, if I can do it, they can do it. Let's expand it. So she was very, very active. She was just more subtle about it. And then every time Nancy would do something, right, she'd get in the P-51, or there's a story of she and Betty Gillies nearly flew a B-17 across the ocean. They did not, but they tried to, right? They got trained in the B-17. They got checked out as first pilots. And then Jackie's response was, okay, so those two elite women can do it. Let's see who else they can do it. And she sent 15 of her women to Lockbourne to be trained in the B-17 as first pilots. So where Nancy wanted to get in the plane herself and do this flying for her and her small group. Jackie wanted to prove that any woman could do it, right? This is something that all these women can do. And much of the literature is about, so the next conflict, we know that we have this tool waiting for us and ready for us. Everybody, by late in the war, everybody's knowing that there would be another war, right? Before they knew there was a bomb, they're like, okay, we're going to end up fighting the Soviets. We're going to end up, right? It was only 20 years between World War I and World War II. So much of this WASP experiment, especially in Jackie's mind, was let's see all these different jobs that the women can do so that we have documentation that we can count on them. And when the next war comes, we can just throw them into position.
So with the competitive nature between the two leaders and their very different styles and approaches, they both were fighting, or they both really had that vested interest in the success of this experiment. But with their positions, despite their credentials, they weren't going to achieve that success on their own. Can you talk a little bit about who maybe advocated for their position, or maybe who were allies along the way to make the WASP a possibility?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. These were prominent women in the field, and they were smart, stubborn, and very competitive, right? With the world and with each other, right? They Nancy Love especially, by God, she was going to get into that next airplane, and the faster one and the heavier one, and she was going to prove she could do it. And Jackie, of course, was this great air racing pilot and going to beat not just the women, but the men. But neither one of them could have achieved their positions without having allies, without having the people in power who believed in them and gave them a shot. Whether it was their pre-war flying and then definitely this program. Both Nancy and Jackie had pushed for it starting in 1939. Jackie Cochran's writing a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt the week after Poland is invaded, saying, "Hey, it's time we need to use the women," right? And I've got the letter back where Eleanor Roosevelt says, "Hey, I've passed your ideas on to Franklin Roosevelt, and the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of War and all these, really prominent people." So Eleanor Roosevelt was one of those advocates who was really pushing and getting Jackie's ideas in front of the right people. But then within the military itself, on the fairing division side, you've got Tunner, who of course goes on and is, leads the fairing division, and, goes on and leads the Berlin airlift after the war. I mean, he's really very prominent. And he loved the idea of using all the pilots he could. He wanted these women pilots to have the opportunity to be ferry pilots. He ends up marrying one of the ferry pilots after the war. But he was a huge advocate, and General George really was very supportive of Nancy Love and worked behind the scenes to make sure that she got into a position of leadership and that she had everything she needed. The first base where the Wasp served was up in Wilmington, and they had this brand new barracks for the officers, and then they had some pretty good barracks for the enlisted, and they were going to put the women in the enlisted barracks, and they didn't have the right bathroom facilities to have all these women. So they kicked all the officers out of their brand new quarters that were literally across the road from the officers club, and put the women in there, just so they could make it happen, so the women could come. So, those advocates were incredibly important. And then on the broader story, you've got Robert Olds, who is the father of Robin Olds, who of course becomes quite famous in Vietnam. But Colonel Robert Olds worked with Nancy and Jackie before the whole program started, had them going into the CAA archives, and had Jackie write up a report that he could then submit to General Arnold, and really pushing these ideas forward. And I'm not sure it would have happened without Robert Olds and General George, because these men convinced General Arnold, who knew Jackie, and Jackie had been pushing, since the 30s. Hey, women need to be flying, women need to be doing these things. And Arnold kept pushing it off, saying, we're not ready for that. We're not in that much trouble. But then he sends Jackie to England to learn about what the women in England were doing. The Air Transport Auxiliary had brought women in as pilots, and he sends Jackie over there to see what's going on there, and then helps Jackie take a group of women to England to fly with the Air Transport Auxiliary. And then, of course, when Jackie comes back to the United States, it's Arnold that stands in the room and says, we're not going to have two programs. You guys work it out. And, because he approved it, and if General Arnold hadn't approved it, it never would have happened. And when I say approving it, they've got to get them, funding to be able to do the things they need to do. And they've got to get them airplanes to train in, and they've got to get them a facility to do it. And this is all during wartime rationing. So if you didn't have support from those highest levels, it just simply never would have happened.
So between support from high levels or advocacy from senior military leaders or community members or the president of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
we really needed advocates to make Nancy and Jackie's dreams a reality.
Mm-hmm.
How about for Nancy and Jackie? How did they act as advocates for the women that they ended up leading and training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Nancy and Jackie were both great advocates for the other women pilots. Nancy worked really hard to make sure that the women had access to other planes. Again, these are the women who served as WAFs, right? That initial group of ferry pilots. The average flight time was over 1,000 hours. And again, this high horsepower rating and this great experience, and they're limited to these, Cubs and, just very small light trainer aircraft. And she pushed and she kept, okay, I'm going to go and tour other bases. And then she'd get into those planes and say, see, let's let all of them get into it too. And as the ferry pilot experiment was successful, they expanded them to 4 other bases. And she left Wilmington because the commanders at Wilmington were limiting the women in the planes that they flew. And that really pushed them to let the women into other planes. And of course, the women based in Wilmington end up flying more P-40s than anybody else in the country. So her advocating by example, leading by example and saying, we got to get the women into this plane. We got to get the women into that plane, really pushed for that. And of course, Jackie was a huge advocate for the women, making sure that they got into military planes, not just civilian planes, which is what they were limited to in the first months of the program, and pushing them to be allowed to do these different jobs, whether it was the initial new job of towing the targets or, the B-17. I mean, they took these women and trained them to be first pilots in the B-17, and then they towed targets behind the B-17, and what an opportunity for these women to prove that they could fly this heavy, big 4-engine aircraft. And that women were perfectly capable and perfectly strong enough to do it when a lot of people didn't know if they would be able to. So it was this constant advocacy and constant, pushing that limit for what women would be allowed to do. And then there was a huge push by both Jackie and Nancy to bring the women into the military because they were initially brought in as civilians with the idea of what the men service pilots would do is you'd bring a qualified man off the street and he'd spend 90 days kind of on a probation, and then he'd become a second lieutenant service pilot. That's what they wanted to do with the women. But Jackie's idea was, no, we're gonna have our own unit, and we're gonna figure out a different way. And it went to Congress and all of these things, and it was a constant push to make them a part of the military. They end up not being brought into the military for a whole host of reasons we'll talk about later. But Jackie was there from the very beginning to the very end. advocating for them to get recognized as part of the military, at least for one day, so they could get the benefits, they could get insurance, they could get all those things they needed.
Jackie really sounds like such a great advocate as far as really fighting for not just their opportunities, but also their livelihood and their benefits.
Mm-hmm. She was a very complicated woman. She was not perfect. But
that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
When we look at all of the limitations, the limited number of aircraft they initially were allowed to fly, and Nancy fought to get them more experience, more airframes. And I think it was something like 77 types of aircraft that they ended up getting to fly, which for those that are familiar with flying in this group, we know 77 is a lot of aircraft to be familiar with. And then they ended up flying something like 60,000 miles, which is so impressive. So they
60
ended
million
up,
miles.
Oh, 60 million. I'm sorry, that's a big difference. 60 million miles, especially when you're thinking most of them remained within the States, right?
They all did.
So all of these limitations and barriers that they faced, they still found great success out of this experiment. But I'm sure it wasn't always the greatest day for them. For Nancy and Jackie, how do you think they maintained that warrior ethos? How did they stay motivated and resilient to keep fighting the good fight for the women that deserved it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it was hard, and they did face a lot of disappointment. And of course, 38 of the women died. And, when Cornelia Fort was one of the very first WAFs, and she was killed in an accident actually flying over Texas. A male pilot got too close to her, and his wing hit hers, and she went in. And this struck Nancy very hard. She borrowed a plane and flew to the funeral. And, there's this long story of them flying through the night in the rain to get there. And, that she could hardly speak. She was so overcome by grief and a sense of responsibility, that somebody she had recruited to do this job had died. But one of the things that came out of the reports on the base, Cornelia had served in California, and there were lots of messages back to the Army Air Forces about how these women, they were shaken and they were sad, but they all went out and got on the flight line and got in those planes the very next day, because they were following Nancy's example, and they were following the example of everyone. It was wartime, and they had a job to do. And so even when they had those bad days, this idea of the mission was greater than themselves. And they knew that they were taking risks. These are planes, especially those who served on the West Coast, flying over those mountains. You guys live in the mountains. What am I saying, right? You understand mountain flying and how dangerous it can be. And, these are planes that just came off the out of the factory, and there were real risks, and there were crashes, and there were, very real dangers. But again, they knew the mission was greater than themselves, and they wanted to prove that women could do it. They wanted to prove that they could do it. And they wanted to help with the war effort. I mean, that was really, I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in that story of the Wasp and all those things that they did. And, they wanted to serve their country, and they wanted to do what they could do. Cornelia Fort was at Pearl Harbor. She was literally in the air at Pearl Harbor, and was shot at, and, had friends die that day. And she wanted to do her part. And I think for all of them, for Nancy and for Jackie both, it was about that bigger picture of proving that women could be these pilots, and what would life be after the war with women in aviation. They were both great proponents of women in aviation. But then that again, as I said, it was not about them. It was about being a part of something that was bigger than them, and that really motivated them and drove them. And I'd say that drove all of these women. And they were a pretty stubborn group of women to begin with, but then to be a part of something so important really drove them as well.
It's just so impressive to hear all that they accomplished within that short time frame and how
Mhm.
they continued to fight even past that. When we look back at all that they accomplished in those 2 years, and everything they fought to change, what as we move forward into the next couple of sessions, we'll go a bit deeper.
Mhm.
But in general, these women, not just Nancy and Jackie, but every single WASP was such an impressive aviator by their own right. Well, not like in the beginning,
Mhm.
before they even joined the WASP.
Mhm.
What are some things that you think overall really kept them going, aside from that national pride in the war effort?
Mhm. Well, I think, all of these women were very independent. That's a personality trait that follows all of them, and they were very stubborn, and very intelligent, every one of them, and they loved to fly. They loved to fly, and you're this is the exact crowd that I can say you always want that next airplane, right? You always want that next airplane. You want the faster one, you want the heavier one. And if she goes out in a P-51, by God, you're going to take the P-38, right? And they were pilots, and that shapes who they are and what they did. And I mean, imagine they come of age in this golden age of aviation when flying was so expensive, and all of a sudden they have the opportunity to fly the very top planes ever made, right? The aircraft that we're talking about, these are the very best airplanes that exist, literally. And these girls, as they would call themselves, right? These are girls getting a chance to get into these planes and to fly these planes and to prove that they can, not just to the world, but to themselves. That's something that they carry with them the rest of your lives. Just like, I don't know about you guys, but the first time I went up and took off by myself, it's like, holy crap, I did that myself. And if I'm going to land, I've got to do it myself. And then when you do, it just changes you. I think that level of, I can do this, I can do these hard things, and I can achieve stuff. I can take an airplane off in the sky and land and not die. And it shapes these women in an era that women don't get to do that. So I think that just that determination to be it. And they were all grateful, right? They were working hard, and they were, taking risks, but to have that opportunity to fly those planes, they all understood that it was special, that this was a once in a lifetime opportunity for them. And, um, you know, they they were so grateful and so proud of the fact that they could do it.
I can absolutely relate to how you described that first flight, just the exhilaration, and flying is such a great way to boost that passion and also build confidence.
Mm-hmm.
You described them as independent and stubborn and intelligent, and I would say that matches pretty much every female pilot I have met.
Mm-hmm.
As we move into each of the next sessions, we're going to dive in deeper into the various aspects. But for now, we're actually going to open up to all of you for questions. We'll take 2 questions. If you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera, you're more than welcome, but we would love you all to chime in now.
Captain Wise, it's Colonel Thomas. I'm just going to read a couple that we've had sent in.
Sure.
So this is from Dr. Lennox, from Molly Sexton. She's a captain. She's stationed at Duke Field. And her question is, one of my greatest frustrations when reading your book is finding out that the WASP identified and fought many of the same battles we are still fighting 80 years later, i.e. uniforms that are not designed to fit us,
Mm-hmm.
which Captain Sexton, you are very prescient, because we are going to talk about this exact thing in a few sessions, and then also during the NCLS session.
Mm-hmm.
But her question is, do you think that the warring factions of Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran surrounding the disposition of the WASP at the end of the war stunted any programs that the women, any progress that the women had made over the course of the war?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and thank you for it. And you're exactly right. when we were preparing for the talks in a few weeks, I was just stunned that they're still talking about Lady Janes and uniforms that don't fit and all of those things. It's like, oh my God, they did all of this. They've done this before. It's just amazing to me. But I think the reality is Nancy and Jackie worked well together. In the book, I've got that section where they had the exchange of the pilots and different things. They wrote letters back and forth to each other quite a bit. The reality is that in the post-war world, they didn't need the women. The only reason they allowed the women to fly was because they were so desperately short of pilots. When we enter that Cold War era, we just don't need as many pilots, and we have so many men who want to continue on in the air, in the new Air Force and as pilots, that they didn't need to. And so I think a lot of the drama that we know that went on between Nancy and Jackie, and I talk about somewhat in the book, most people didn't know about it, right? They were, you keep your dirty laundry in the house, right? And so most of that wasn't seen. A lot of the leadership that might have known about it and that was on opposing sides was supportive of the women. But again, that excuse to have the women there of we're desperate for pilots wasn't there anymore. And so they just, they didn't need the women, so they didn't let them have that opportunity, even though they'd proven it. And again, a lot of this comes out of this same idea in the 1950s, where you see a lot of women not being given admission to medical school, and not being given admission to law school, and not being given admission to all these things, because they were just going to go home and have babies anyway. And Jacqueline Cochran herself said that. Jacqueline Cochran said, the normal thing, the natural thing for women to do is to get married and have babies. And so she did not advocate for women continuing to serve in the military, especially as pilots, because pilot training is very expensive. And, you don't want to waste all the money on the women because they would just get married and have babies. And that's kind of surprising when Jackie was such an advocate for the women, but she was not supportive of them serving after the war. And Nancy just was kind of tired of it all, and she did go home and have babies. So it's I don't think their conflict was a factor, but it's a really good question.
Okay, in the last few minutes we've got here, we have one more question. This is from Marcel Johnson. Dr. Johnson says, I recently read a book written by Fannie Flagg, the all-girl filling station's last reunion, which wove stories about the Wasp into the plot. I was fascinated by the stories. What do you think is the role of historical fiction, and could it help in bringing awareness to readers regarding the amazing women who served in the Wasp?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good. And I've had some conversations with Fannie Flagg. She actually reviewed the book very nicely. I think historical fiction is a good tool. Obviously I'd like everybody to read my nonfiction because it's accurate and I spent 20 years on it, but absolutely. I think fiction is an important tool to tell these stories. And, fiction authors can tell the stories in a way I can't, where I have a document, usually 3 documents for every point I make, and I can't make Dora go do something, go be a ferry pilot, because she wasn't. But Fannie Flagg or other fictional authors certainly can, right? They can make composite characters and have them doing things that a Wasp theoretically could do, but we don't know if they actually did. So my goal, and I've said this before, but my goal is to spread the story as widely as possible of these women pilots. And, I never want to walk in another room where nobody's heard of the women again. I think, they were forgotten for too long. And so I think it's up to all of us to share their story And if that's through fictional writing, or there's several plays that have been written and performed about the Wasp, and the more the merrier. It's not a competition. I think we all have the same mission, is to share the story of these women. So thanks for the question.
Cool. And we've got one last one. I'll give a shout out. I'm not going to use your name because you are underage, but I want to give a shout out to a young aviator, aspiring aviator out there. And she says, I'm 12 years old and I'm curious, what was the average age for the Wasp women? I'm hoping to be a pilot.
Good for you, and glad to have you join us. Thank you so much. So the average age was actually 24, but it really changes over time. When the women started, their minimum age was 21, and so it kind of skews older. But by the end of the war, the age was lower, and they were allowed to be 18 and a half when they flew. A lot of these women were 16 and 17 when they learned to fly and get their pilot's license. Some of them had to wait until they were 18 to get in. So the average age was actually a little older than, if you look at the later classes that trained, they're going to be much younger. Where those early ferry pilots that had all that experience, several of them were in their 30s, their early 30s. But yeah, go for it. I hope you belong to Women in Aviation International. They have a really great Girls in Aviation Day. And they even have a Girls in Aviation magazine and all sorts of great opportunities like that. So Women in Aviation International is a great nonprofit organization that'll help you out. And if you get up to EAA, come and see me. I go up to EAA in Oshkosh every year.
Those were some awesome questions. Thank you so much. And good luck, especially to the young lady with us as she her dreams. You have lots of people rooting for you in this group for sure. Dr. Landick, as we move forward, we'll post the links for your podcast and your book. Where else can people learn about Wasp or get a hold of you?
Right, absolutely. I do have a website, CatherineSharpLandick.com. So you can go there. I'm also a professor at Texas Women's University, which is home to the Wasp Archive. So if you want to learn more about the history of the Wasp, and they have literally thousands of pictures of the Wasp that have been digitized. So if you go to the Texas Women's University library webpage, it'll kind of lead you to that. And it's a lot of fun too. So yeah, but there is a link on my website if you want to contact the author. Be happy to hear from anybody.
Thank you. And I'll make a plug here. Dr. Landick is one of our speakers at NCLS this year. So you are more than welcome to register and go to her main talk and her workshop as well. So as we wrap up, Dr. Landick, thank you so much. This is such a great opportunity for us all to learn about the Wasp and to be able to share their story and make sure that they're not forgotten, just like you were talking about. So next session, so this is part one of a 3-part series. So part 2, we're going to go into more of the societal context that the Wasp grew up in during that golden age of aviation. And then as they became military aviators, what was life like for them? And what were some of those barriers from society that they faced? We'll dive into that next week. But in the chat, you'll find links for Dr. Landick's podcasts, and her book, The Women with Silver Wings, is an excellent read. We hope that you all enjoy those links, and feel free to sign up for the other sessions and for NCLS. We'll stick around for just a few moments, but that wraps up for today. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. I appreciate you.